So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this deep dive and discussion around containerizing Foreman. Just so you know, the live streaming and live streams in general can be a bit volatile. So if you have any problems viewing the live stream, you can either drop a message in the chat and join us in the discussion on Google Hangouts, or you can watch the recording of this as this video is being recorded. Today, Ondrej and Ohad will talk about containerizing Foreman, as I said. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Freenode IRC or in the YouTube live chat. And I think that's everything from me, other than if you would like to take part in a similar deep dive or have suggestions for other deep dives that you'd like to see, please feel free to reach out to us and we will put something together. So, Ondrej, over to you now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Ohad, did you want to go first or should I?
No, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll just share my screen. And it's not working for some reason. It used to work a minute ago. Interesting.
It's because live, anything live. Something's happening now. Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Right. So today I'll be talking about Foreman in containers, and I'd like to especially focus on plugins because they're important. They bring tons of functionality and they have impact on application as a whole. And that's actually one of the first questions that I asked myself. If I wanted Foreman in container, how would I do plugins? So I looked into that, and today I'd like to talk about what I found out. But before I get to that, I'll briefly go over the things that have been already done in this area. And in the end, there are still some questions that need answering. So I'd like you to join me and share your opinions and whether what you see and hear today will make sense or not too. Okay, so this is what I've already said. And when I speak about Foreman in containers, what does it actually mean? Because when I go to the Foreman repo and scroll down a bit, I can see that there is already a Docker file and Docker Compose. So presumably we already have a way to run Foreman in container. What I'd like is to have a production instance of Foreman that would run in container and provide me with more or less the same as Foreman installed from packages. And when I go to the quick start guide, in our documentation, I can see there's a list of supported platforms, but there's no mention of containers anywhere. So what I'd like is to select an option from the drop-down and choose containers. And I would get a list of steps, which would presumably include where to get the images and how to run them. And if I go back to the Docker file and Docker Compose in the Foreman repo, we do have documentation for that, which is inside developer docs. And the first sentence states that the goal of this tutorial is to help developers to use quickly and easily a ready-made Foreman container. So this is primarily aimed at developers. And there's a list of steps that you can take if you want to get this running. Probably no surprises if you've ever used Docker Compose before. There is support for plugins, which includes rebuilding the image and linking your local checkout to plugins, which is pretty much similar to what we would do in development if we want to add a plugin for development. So this is, to me, this reads like this is mostly for development and not quite for production. There is also Foreman Cube. Ohad will probably have more information about that. But again, from the perspective of plugins, it states that it does not include any additional plugins. And if you need any, you need to rebuild your image. And in that regard, you're pretty much on your own. Installation or setup instructions are pretty straightforward. If I take a look at the deploy sh, it creates all the resources in your Kubernetes cluster. So again, not many surprises here. Another approach was by Eric in grepl, which uses OpenShift from the get-go and uses also Ansible for some tasks. But what about plugins? Because that's what I'd like to focus on. So if I go to the images, you can see it also deals with the Catello stack. And if I take a look at Foreman image, you can see that it installs a set of predefined plugins. So this is not great because, again, no support for installation of additional plugins. And perhaps you don't need all of these. Maybe you need just some of them. And there's really no way, or at least no documented way, how to customize the image. And if you notice, both rebuilding of the image makes sure that the plugin and Foreman is actually in the same image. So I'm wondering, are there any other options for that? And another option for plugin is microservices, which puts each plugin into its separate container, and they all talk to each other via REST API. But if you know Foreman plugin infrastructure at least a little, then you know that Foreman plugins are really not a separate applications, and they need core to run. So unless we are ready to invest in changing our plugin infrastructure, this is not really a viable way. And from the previous discussions, it seems like there are no plans to do this because the cost would be too high. Another option would be to have a sidecar container. So what exactly is that? And the example that I often run into for sidecar container is the log aggregation. And sidecar container is an additional container that runs inside a pod together with the main application, and in this example, and they talk to each other using a shared volume. So in this example, the main application produces logs and writes them into shared volume, and the log aggregator reads from the shared volume and moves the logs into external storage because they need to be archived for whatever reason. The thing to note here that, again, the main application and log aggregator are separate applications. They don't necessarily need to know about each other. The main application just produces logs and stores them into the volume and doesn't care what happens next. Log aggregator just reads from the shared volume and doesn't care who produced the files there and just moves them into external storage. But for Foreman, again, Foreman plugins are not separate applications. So if we were to make this work with Foreman plugins, we would need to assemble the application when the container with plugin starts. So at that point, we would need to copy the plugin files into the shared volume. And we would also need to notify Foreman that there is a new plugin and where to look for its files in the shared volume. And at the very least, we would also need to restart the Foreman. And this could work. It has two disadvantages that I can see, and they are quite significant. The first one is that even though we have an additional container, we still need to run actions against the Foreman container and do some modifications. And that's really not great. And the second thing is that once the files are copied into the shared volume, we can just remove this container because it's not being used. Foreman now uses the files that are in the shared volume. So the only thing we used the second container for was to copy the files into the shared volume. And if that's all we need it for, do we really have to have it? So that really brings us to the last item, which is everything in one image or one container. And that's what we already saw. And that's not ideal. So I'm thinking, is there a way for users to get an image with a desired set of plugins? And it turns out it's not difficult to do using Ansible. So first I'll run my Ansible playbook, and then I'll explain what it does, because it will run for a while. I'll just copy this because I'm not great at talking and typing at the same time. Here we go. Right. So the idea behind this is that if we can't really ship a pre-built image, we'll provide a tool that will allow users to build a customized image. And this should be done in such a manner that it's very user-friendly. I'm thinking one command at the most. So in this case, I'm running Ansible playbook, and I'm passing it a couple of extra variables. First one is version, so I'll be using Foreman 2.0, then Foreman version build, which will be used for tag, and then I specify a list of plugins. And the playbook is quite simple. It does just a couple of things. It creates a local build directory. It creates a Docker file from a template. It copies some assets into the build directory, and then it builds the image. And once our image is built, it would be actually good to test it, that it contains what we want it to contain. And the best way to do that would be actually to run it. Luckily, I already have an instance of Minishift locally, so we'll use that to run our image. And I also have a route, which will allow me to see what's actually inside my Kubernetes cluster. So if I go there, and then I can see that there is already Foreman running. Let me just quickly log in. And everything seems to be working. The instance is pretty empty, but otherwise it should be working properly. If I go to the About page, I can see that I have already Smart Proxy, and if I take a look at the plugins, I can see there are no plugins currently. And my setup is pretty simple. As you can see, I have deployment of proxy, I have Foreman, I have Postgres, and Redis for caching. And the usual way to actually update your deployment would be going to the YAML file that defines the deployment, and that might look something like this, for example. And down here we can see that there is image, and we would just change it to the image to the new image, and then we would apply the changes. But this file is currently not being used, and actually I'm going to do something a little bit different. So instead of current deployment, I'm going to edit a different file, which is current Foreman. And down here in the spec section, there is Foreman image entry, and I'll change it to demo, which is the image that we are currently building. And it's still building. It shouldn't really take much longer. Right. So we'll wait for it to build. And once it's built, we would probably want to push into a registry. But luckily, I don't have to do that because I have things set up in a way that Minishift sees the images that I built locally. But in a real life scenario, you'd probably have a CI job that runs, that builds your image, and on successful build, it pushes into your registry. This was faster when I was doing a dry run. Come on now.
Maybe while it's running, you could say a bit about what the playbook is actually doing, how it's building the container, new image.
Yeah, I'll get to that, but now we are finally built. So, okay. Right. So we can see that there is a Foreman 2.0-demo, which was just built. So let me apply the changes. Right, and actually, let me show this in UI, because that way I won't have to do manual polling. The page refreshes on its own and shows changes as they happen. And we can see that there is one container that is being created and one is being terminated. It's the Foreman, as we expected. I'll just wait for this to finish to be sure that everything ended properly as we expect. And once the old pod is terminated, right, I'll go back to Foreman. Come on. I will go back to Foreman, and eventually I will see that there is a new plugin installed. And if I go to the menu, I can see that the OpenSCAP menu entries are there. So this seems to be working. And for OpenSCAP, I'll need also a proxy with OpenSCAP feature. So I'll go back to the file with kind Foreman. And down here in the smart proxies, I'll add another proxy. And it will be, let's say, a SCAP proxy dash SCAP. Again, I'll check for the image that it's really there. I've already built it as a preparation for this demo. And then again, I'll apply the changes. And while we wait for the changes to propagate, I'll actually explain what's going on. So I have in my, I have here also an additional pod, which is the operator. And operator is something that knows how to update your application. In my particular case, it's Ansible operator, and it runs Ansible playbook. And operator watches custom resource. The operator is set up in a way that it watches a custom resource, which is this kind Foreman resource. Kubernetes allows you to define custom resources as an API extension. And if I go to the command line, I can do this and get a list of my Foreman. As you can see, there's example Foreman, which corresponds to this definition, this YAML file. If I can describe the resource in a similar fashion as I would do with any other. You can see all the entries, and the fields from the spec get passed to the Ansible playbook that is executed by the operator. So that way, the operator is able to actually run the image that I want. And as you can see, the changes have finished. And if I go back to the correct tab and refresh the page, I'll go to Smart Proxies, and now I can see that I have already registered a new Smart Proxy with an OpenSCAP feature. By the way, this approach with operators and Ansible, that's something that Eric used in grepl, and he told me that this was working for him quite nicely. So I was curious, and I looked into that a bit. And I don't think everyone knows about operators, and that's why I wanted to show that as a part of this demo, because they have some nice features to offer. Great. So we actually saw a number of things. You are able to get a Foreman image with a set of plugins that we wanted. You are able to run that image, and you are able to do that for Smart Proxy as well. And essentially, we went over how to install a plugin in Containerized Foreman, which is nice. Still, there are problems that need looking into. For example, I'm currently running on HTTP only. There's no HTTPS, and there's no Apache in my setup, which is fine for demo, not great for production. And the reason is that when running without Catillo, Apache uses the Puppet certificates. And since we are not really interested in shipping Puppet server as part of Foreman, then that leaves me currently without certificates. And there are at least two ways how to solve this. The first one would be to say, okay, so we'll always have Catalog, and that would be great for developers because it would shrink the testing matrix. We wouldn't have to test with and without Catalog. On the other hand, Catalog is quite a big plugin, and it brings its own dependencies, which means those will be in additional containers, and that costs additional resources. And not every user uses Catalog in the upstream, and they might not be quite happy about having part of application they're not really using, and that which consumes additional resources. Another solution would be to wait for certificate infrastructure redesign, as was proposed. We could say that this will be our solution for containers as well, and we will wait for this to arrive. Maybe there are other solutions to this, to the certificates that I'm currently not seeing. Another thing that Tomer already mentioned, how do I build the image? I leveraged packaging for building the image. And I did that for convenience because I was more concerned about whether to put plugins in the same containers in the same container as Foreman or in different ones. So I wanted to build a bunch of images quickly, and I wasn't looking too closely at how I built them. I wasn't trying to optimize my builds or anything like that. Basically, as long as the image built and it didn't crash on start and contained what I needed, that was good enough for me. And that made me that saved me some steps that I would need to look into, such as whether to use multi-container builds for compiling assets. And that's something I would be definitely facing when I would clone from Git and build from that. Image builds are a big topic. They probably deserve a separate session. But the reason why I'm talking about that is, again, from the perspective of plugins, this is not ideal because some users have their private plugins and they don't necessarily go through the packaging. And making people do packaging so that they can build an image is not nice. And therefore, I'd like to ask, how do people install their private plugins? Do you clone from Git? Do you gem install? Do you do something completely different? I'd like to know, because that way we can provide a tool for building images that supports these scenarios. Again, I have kind of a hunch that people who build their own plugins won't have too much trouble rebuilding the image on their own. But I don't want users to fend for themselves. I want their experience to be smooth. And that's why I'd like to help in that area as much as possible. So yeah, that's image building. And another thing is that I want to ask whether this was helpful. Whether it makes sense what you saw today, and whether we should invest our time in efforts such as these in the future, and if so, how should we do that? How should we make the process more visible, and where should we concentrate the efforts? Because right now the plugin-related stuff is in at least 3 repositories. 2 of them are clearly aiming at the same thing, that is running Foreman in production in containers. Each of them focuses on a little bit different parts, approaches things from a little bit different angle, but the ultimate goal is the same. And I'd like to know if you have any proposals how to proceed in the future, because we've talked about containers in the past, and lately again there hasn't been much going on, and maybe it would be good to somehow have focus on the things that we can solve now, things that we are blocked on, and so on. So I realize that these are pretty big questions. Each of them probably deserves their own session. And I don't expect to get the definite answers today, but it's something that I see as the next steps, and probably we want to answer them at some point to progress. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ondrej. I think, first of all, I'm grateful for your presentation. I mean, it's a great presentation and definitely extensive. If possible, I would like to have the second part more of a discussion, and I welcome everyone to collaborate as much as we can online, IRC or here or elsewhere. I think there's a couple of things kind of worth calling out, and you have I think an extensive experience now with containers and their limitations, and I can say I had a not so recent, but over the year or so, a couple of years ago when we started that, also went through, I think, a very similar process to what you've done. And I want to, I guess I want to spend a minute on the basics of where we came from and what I think we should be doing next if we want to move it forward. So I think there's two main personas that can benefit the containers work. The first and foremost is the user, right? If you today want to try out a new software, you do Docker run something, and I don't know, half a minute later, you most likely have it running. This is the user experience that is now the norm for any applications or software that you're running. But if you look at, and you show that, like if you look into installing Foreman, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? Even in the amount of time it takes or the amount of questions you have. So I think the ramping up experience is something that users actually come to expect when it comes to running it as a container versus, oh, now I have to dedicate a VM with all of that stuff. And also in terms of, okay, so how do I upgrade? How long does the upgrade take? What's the maintenance window that I need to put, how long will it be down? And how painful is the upgrade? Can I revert? And all of those things that I think the way Foreman has done things pretty much didn't change significantly over the last years. So if I try kind of to jump to the conclusion, I think in order to really leverage, oh, sorry, and the other part was the other persona I was talking about is the developer. So if you think about, you highlighted a few of the challenges that we have today. You have things like packaging, whether it's RPM packaging, for Ruby or JavaScript. There is a whole pipeline. There's complexity. The bar is fairly high. You don't see a lot of maintainers that are doing packages. Or I'm happy to be wrong, but I think you're not seeing a lot of people who contribute to the packaging infrastructure. And also in general, I mean, how likely is a developer to run a real production-like environment versus just Ruby on his VM or on his laptop or something, and kind of able to simulate real production environments. It's like usually you have to spin up a whole VM and have a full-blown Foreman on it. So from a developer perspective, I think containers are appealing. Now, I think if we want to be serious about this, then there's few steps that needs to happen. And the first thing is that we want to start streamlining containers as a solution to multiple things. So instead of, I think what we normally do in Foreman is let's support yet another thing, and then we have Debian packages, RPM packages, and now container builds as a third outcome of the process. I think we need to try and simplify how we do stuff. In the past, I believe it was Timo who suggested a path where let's just build a container for some services that can be packaged inside an RPM or a Debian, and then there is a systemd script that starts and stops those containers. So instead of having 3 variants, let's say just the basic Foreman install, instead of having a Debian build of Foreman and an RPM build of Foreman, and then for every distribution, you could have one build of a containerized Foreman or Smart Proxy or whatever component, Redis, Postgres, and so on, and just have a systemd startup file that runs the container for you. That eliminates a lot of the burden in packaging, and it effectively takes away a whole big chunk of work that is done behind the scene that users normally don't see, of continuously updating the spec files and all the build artifacts. The second thing I think we need to do is to, as you demonstrated, have a container build service. If you look at similar projects, even where our forum is running this course, if you ever went for an upgrade process, you would see that it will check which plugins you're using. If you're using the standards, or that there are presets where an image is already available, it will just download it from the internet. But if you have a customized plugin, behind the scene, it will build a new image for you. And once it's ready, it will basically restart into the new image. So that actually gives us the ability to control upgrades of Foreman in Foreman instead of completely external to Foreman. You could download stuff. You could have code that revert if it failed, or all kinds of things like that that actually enrich, in my opinion, the user experience. So just imagine a pop-up saying a new version of Foreman is available. Do you want to upgrade now? You say yes. Behind the scene, it downloads the new containers and just restart them. So I think if we really want to use containers, in my opinion, we should go all in or significantly invest in it as a new way of delivering software, and not just as yet another way of let's do Debian, RPM, and now container builds. And then I think you highlighted correctly the reason that we didn't put the container. So if you look in the repo you mentioned earlier, where there's a Docker file and a README, and it says this is not production yet. The main reason is, I think, not the technology. Technically, that Docker file has been building on every commit since it was introduced, with zero or nearly zero failures. Just for the sake of it, I'm just going to show just one small thing. Hopefully, I'm showing the right window. 1 second. I have too many. You have to bear with me that I find my right window. Okay. So this is Quay. For those who don't know, Quay is a service like Docker Hub that builds containers. Let me just zoom in a little bit. And in here, I have my personal projects, but I also have access to the official Foreman repo on Quay. This is where you ran, if you run the Docker Compose or if you run the Kubernetes environments, this is where the image is coming from. You can see there are multiple images that are being built, and you can see here also history of how many actions and events. Basically, these are container builds. So if we go back here, you would see that every commit that we had on the develop branch or any of the stable branches, there's basically a container image behind the scene that is being built and people actually can pull those images without any need for building images themselves. So what we have today is a continuous build infrastructure that basically requires very little attention, which is great. This is exactly, I think, what you would ask if you want to have a build environment that is low on maintenance. It builds, no need to go into the details, but it does build. The plugin scenario is also handled in the current Docker file. I think really this is a matter of decision that we want to start providing Foreman as in a containerized format. There are challenges in terms, like you indicated, over the years we've like with the certificates and other things. Over the years we had to solve quite a few things like that. For example, all of the settings are now available as environment variables, so you can pass them to your containers and so on. So all of these things over the years, I think it's a matter of a decision at the end of the day. There is no technical barrier to consuming containers, whether they're standalone on Docker or whether they're used in a large Kubernetes environment. We've shown that it works and it's stable. And I think coming back, I think it's just a decision that we need to make. And that will be my recommendation, really, to ask ourselves, this is more of the people who maintain Foreman, if we want to start taking steps in that direction where we improve the user experience on onboarding experience, and what you would expect from software in 2020. If this is what we want to do and change and evolve Foreman into. And I'm not saying deprecate RPMs or anything like that, but set it as a goal where we have using those containers in the pipelines and running all the tests and end-to-end UI tests and everything, basically, and promote it. So I see it less of a technical issue, and I will be very happy to see Foreman takes the steps to use it. So that was my part, much shorter than yours.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that ties nicely to the questions that I raised. I think these are additional ones that need answering and basically decide on the next steps and where we want to go, and whether we decide to maybe run containers under systemd instead of doing Debian packages. That's something we need to decide and answer and somehow commit to that if we do decide that that's exactly what we want to do.
Yeah, technically you can today, take out so for example, a Debian package of Smart Proxy. Again, the point is that whenever you change it, because containers are supposed to be immutable, whenever you change it, you have to build a new image. But if we find from surveys or other data that we have, let's say, 10 most common combinations of plugins, we could have Jenkins jobs that continuously build those, just like we continuously build packages. And then I would say on average, 8 out of 10 users probably just download the new container image, just like they would download an RPM. And the building becomes something that is less common, and then we offer it as a kind of a service that you have within the application, or some other mechanism. But basically, we would need to design such a solution, adjust our documentations and so on. But if you take the Debian packages, really, you shouldn't be a big deal to replace the Debian logic and taking the source codes and everything, or RPM for that matter, and just taking a container image that was built, wrapping it inside an RPM, and Docker run or Podman run it as an equivalent of a process. Systemd actually has a nice support for running containers, and we can probably experiment with Redis or something that is not changing that often or impactful. And in my opinion, this will probably be the easiest way to experience these new flows.
Thanks, Ohad. Ondrej, I don't know, did you see, but Ewout just dropped some comments into IRC. He's watching at a bit of a delay. And just on the point about certificates, he says that today it's 100% possible to replace all certificates, but you need your own CA. Nothing is tied to Puppet CA other than the defaults in the installer, or really you don't even need your own CA, just certificates with matching names. I'm just reading that to you in case you didn't see it.
Yeah, I saw that. I just didn't manage to reply yet. But thanks. I did not know that that was possible, but still you need the certificates, right? So that's additional step that users need to take, and that's something we would probably want to provide right out of the box. So, or at least provide some way for users to generate those certificates and provide that as a supported way of doing things, if it will be a supported solution for setting up certificates and part of Foreman installation.
The good thing, these kind of challenges have been solved already over and over in some other products and projects. So obviously, if you go full into Kubernetes, you have as you showed, you have a route in OpenShift or ingress in Kube. And there is support for SSL termination, and you basically configure the SSL termination in that level. And there is some load balancer behind the scene that will, route the traffic to the right container. But also, if you run in a standalone without something like Kube, there are containers that aim to do exactly that, whether they are load balancing or SSL termination. It's just you just need to maybe use different components that we did until now, and maybe Apache is not as common, Nginx is more common, or maybe there are other combinations or both. But nothing is, all of these, for good or bad, all of these things have already been solved. And again, this is just a matter of deciding we want to go there. I think keeping the current architecture and not changing it while doing containers at the same time will be very challenging. That's basically the reason why I stopped, because I got to the point where I solved all the technical limitations, and now this is the people reorganization challenge, and I couldn't get that, or I didn't have the time as I would like to have the time to invest in making that happen.
Yeah, I realize that some solutions might be better for containers and that we are currently not using. But again, if we switch to Nginx from Apache in containers, at the same time we'll still have RPM installations, and RPMs will have Apache because there's no reason for them to switch to Nginx. So now our technology stack grows, and we have duplication. So again, it's a question where we want to go, and do we really want to have a different stack in containers and in the installation that we provide from packages, or do we switch both to Nginx and stuff like that? So yeah, definitely additional.
So I don't know. So looking at this specific, I don't know if Nginx is a solution or the tool, but there's two things worth mentioning in this context. First of all, containers having the nature of being immutable kind of implies reproducible, and implies also that you have less combinations of things to test. One of the nice things, in my opinion, is decoupling yourself from the various distributions and their limitations. So you know that the same container build can run on multiple operating systems, or multiple containers will run together regardless of which operating system they're running on. there's actually very little impact of, if you're running on Ubuntu, Debian, Rails, CentOS, and so on, if you're running a container. So you don't really need to set up a whole new this hard metrics. I need to support these versions of Ruby. I need to support these versions of Node. I need to support these versions of Postgres. I need to, all of that complexity basically goes away by you defining which container images you're going to use and ensuring that whatever operating system that runs the containers basically use the same images. So from that point of view, you would basically say, I'm going to run Nginx or Apache as a load, or HA proxy as a load balancer to all of my Foreman instances. I'm going to define how many times Foreman should run as a load balancer capability, just like we had in Passenger. And something will schedule 5 replicas of Foreman behind the load balancer, will configure it automatically for you, and you don't worry about, oh, someone else might running the same combination but with a different Ruby, or someone might, you have a lot less variables in these kind of deployments.
Yeah, from this perspective, yes. I was more thinking about that you need different set of configurations. For this example, you need configuration for Apache and configuration for Nginx that does the same. And if you add, let's say, a new feature, you need to make changes for Apache and you need to make changes for Nginx. And this is more effort and requires more work than if you had the same, if you had Apache or Nginx in the both places. So that was mostly what I was thinking of.
What I'm saying is that you become opinionated and you decide if you support Nginx or Apache, and you deliver them as part of the solution, and then you don't have this issue of, I need to support both. You will only support one of them. That's how your deployment works. That's part of the solution, and you know exactly which versions are getting deployed, and you don't need to deal with this, oh, on Debian it fails, or on older version of CentOS it failed, or Ruby or whatever. In my opinion, this is the biggest value, honestly. There's so much less, if you look at the CI metrics, we always had like different Rubies, different nodes, versions, different database versions, different databases altogether in the past. That was a lot of effort just to make sure it all runs and doesn't break on various operating systems. We need to have slaves with very different operating systems and all kinds of things, that a lot of infrastructure just to make sure it works. And with containers, you're basically swapping it and saying, no, we're testing one combination that works, and we are going to deliver you all of that. You have a way to reproduce that entire combination regardless of your runtime operating system. So in my opinion, that's the biggest value that for developers is, like, you don't need a complicated build infrastructure at all compared to what Foreman has today, which is a lot of effort to maintain. So I'll pick on Tomer because we have a couple more minutes, and I know you're also here. What do you think we should do next?
Okay, I wasn't expecting, but I think first thing to do is to decide if this is indeed the direction that we want to go. Because if we do, I agree with you, Ohad, it's not a technical issue, it's not something that can't be done, it's a matter of priorities and dedicating the resources needed to get it done. That's, I think, a question of priorities that the larger developer community and other stakeholders need to think about. Because perhaps that means that if we focus on this now, we'll need to postpone some other efforts that are currently in progress or that we plan. I think in the long term, it's definitely something we should consider doing. I agree that simplifying the deployment to one supported deployment and maybe with some variants of which plugins you have installed. It's something that's worth having, even though we did drop a bunch of stuff on what we support already. So I think if in the past you had a question, for example, of which database you use with Foreman, now that question is answered, and even with the move to Part 3, I think that's even simplifying that more, because there's one less piece of moving technology to take care of. So I think that's the general trend is going towards that. I think also the certificate handling that was mentioned will help solve and simplify the certificate workflows, which are really painful today if you do anything outside of the very default setup. You roll into a whole world of fun. And I know there's been also some considerations with regards to the Part 3 integration and uncoupling Catelo from Pulp, so it uses the REST API and not goes directly to the database and does all sorts of strange stuff that we used to do with Pulp 2. So that also allows an easier path to decoupling, but it's definitely going to require a whole lot of effort to get done. I think getting the plugins right is probably the most difficult thing in the mix. Perhaps it's something that can be solved with some sort of form where you can select which version of Foreman you want and which plugins. And if that combination doesn't exist, we'll build it. If it does, we'll use the same image.
Yeah, I mean, if I look, I think the ultimate decision should be around impact or no impact to user experience, right? If you think someone in a couple of years from now will accept to install software on his VM and not expect it to run in a containerized fashion, I think this is like, if we are making POCs a lot easier, or if we're making experimental effort, allow people to experiment with it, so increase the user base, make it more accessible, if that's a thing or not, and also how important it is for us to make seamless upgrades, so reduce the downtimes of upgrade, make it easy, and also to scale. There is a side effect of, you just reminded me when you talked about decoupling Pulp and Catelo, the fact it runs in containers, it implies everything has a different IP. The cross-container communication is over, assuming you're never on the same machine, right? Not the database, and then it implies they're portable. So you can run them on different machines, and also you could run many times, especially for web apps, you can run multiple instances. So you can run multiple formats and then scale it out across multiple machines. And this is why you have tools like Kubernetes. They do exactly that. And if you want to make life interesting, then this kind of solutions allow you to have zero downtimes, which implies you can have some containers running with the old version, then you introduce a new version, you start new containers with the new version, and only once the new ones are available, you rip off the old ones. That implies some changes to how we do database migrations and things like that, but these are things that have been, best practices, I guess, over the last few years. So in my opinion, it comes back to, do we want to expose this kind of user experience to our users and how they deal with install and upgrades? And that will probably be what will define if we want to invest further or not.
Thanks, but I have to drop now. Thank you very much. was a very interesting demo, and I hope the discussion that follows will be even more interesting.
Okay. So thank you all for listening until now. Ondrej, thank you for making the slides. It was great, and the presentation, of course. And hopefully there is a Discord follow-up. So.
Exactly, and thank you to both of you for a very entertaining hour. And I think there has been a lot of very large questions asked, posed during this. I haven't seen a lot of questions come in on the live stream, and I suspect that's because a lot of these points need some thinking. So I'm hoping that this will continue on to discourse if anyone has anything else, and if anyone wants a follow-up session, just reach out and we can organize something. So thank you for everyone who joined us on the call. Thank you to the presenters, and thanks to everybody watching on the stream. We will talk soon.